Today we are going to be talking about how we live the Jesus stuff in relationships. We are wrapping up this series that we've been in, the Jesus stuff, and we've been studying the book of Colossians. And today is a very practical message about our discipleship to Jesus. It's very practical, and I've got just 40 minutes to go through a chapter and a half of the Bible. And so, like Leslie said, buckle up, put your seatbelts on. And today we're going to be talking all about how to live the Jesus stuff as wives, husbands, children, parents, workers, leaders, strangers, neighbors, and friends. All right, y'all ready for this? Let's jump in. Hey, it's one thing that I know about relationships is that relationships can be messy. In March 2020, Leslie and I, we were getting ready for this beautiful Saturday that we had planned with our family and with some friends. And we had spent the morning cleaning up our house because that's a lot of times what we'll do on Saturday morning. So we're getting it looking nice and fresh and clean. And our kids were little back then. Hudson was about a year and a half old, and Hadley was just 2 weeks old, and we had this great plan to go and meet our friends at Chick-fil-A that morning. And this is a big deal, okay, because it's a monumentous moment for a child, their first experience at Chick-fil-A. They got to get that Christian chicken. They got to make sure that you get them started on it early. And so we're excited for it. We're ready for it. And after we had cleaned our house, we're getting ready to leave. And right before we walk out the door, I walk past our fireplace, and I notice on the fireplace, on the floor tile in front of the fireplace, that there was some ashes that had kind of spilled out and were sitting right there. And so we're about to leave, and I was like, hold on, Leslie, let me get the vacuum real quick. Let me clean this up. And so I go to my garage, and I grab the shop vac, and I don't know why I picked the shop vac, but I did. And I grab the shop vac, and I put it down in front of the fireplace, and then I plug it into the wall. And then I grab the hose, and I plug the hose into the shop vac, and I'm holding the hose here right at the fireplace. And I go to the shop vac, and I flip on the on switch, and all of a sudden, whoo, ashes start to fly everywhere all around me. This wave, this wall of ash and smoke starts to cover me and cover our living room and work its way into the kitchen where Leslie and the kids were. Leslie starts to scream and cry, and the kids are screaming and crying, and I'm screaming and crying. And I'm like, what is happening? And I look down at the shop vac, and I had plugged the hose not into the vacuum side, but into the blow side of the vacuum. This is a big problem when the hose is pointing right at the fireplace. And so it's blowing smoke and ashes all over the place. And so Leslie starts to retreat with the kids outside of the house. She's out there, and I'm inside just trying to figure out what to do. And I'm panicking, and I did what any person, I guess, would do in this moment. I unhooked the hose, I put it to the vacuum side, and I'm holding the hose in the air, and I'm trying to suck up all the smoke and the ash in the air and on my couch and all over the place, and it's just black ash flowing all the way through this house that we had just cleaned. It was a mess. We had cleaned this house, and all of a sudden, everything was messy. And so we tried to kind of tidy up a little bit, the best that we could. And then we get in the car, and we go to Chick-fil-A, and we sit down with our friends, and we pretend like nothing ever happened. It was a crazy morning. It was a wild time. And here's one thing that I learned that day. I learned that there is a way that a shop vac works. And if used the right way, it can be a great tool. It can be a great blessing. It can help you clean things up. But when you use it the wrong way, it can make a mess that you're going to be left cleaning up for hours. See, there's a way that relationships work as well. And if done the Jesus way, and if done with the Jesus stuff, they can be a great blessing, or if not, they can be messy and the source of so much pain and frustration. So you can have this great plan for your life, this great plan to have lifelong friendships, this great plan to have high expectations on those dates that you're going on with that guy or that girl. And you may have great plans to be a parent, and you may have great plans to build these relationships in your life. But then all of a sudden, something can seem to go wrong, and it makes a mess of everything. So we all crave deep down healthy relationships. We want the deep, lifelong relationships that we see in those TV shows that we love or that we read about in the books. Or we long for those Nickolas Sparks type romantic relationships, like that relationship of our dreams. And we long for that marriage that we hear preached about by our pastors. And we're like, I know that that's possible. That's what I want. And we want that dream job that offers us the perfect work-life balance. And we want that boss that we don't want to send nasty emails to. And we want to still also make dollar bills. And then we also want kids that do everything that we say, that listen and that obey and that grow up to be successful and take care of us one day when we're old and decrepit. That's what we're after. But the problem is that oftentimes those relationships don't work out the way that we'd hoped. Our marriages on Instagram may appear to be put together and polished, but behind closed doors, they are stale, stagnant, and anything but happy, covered in ashes. And the problem is that we look around at this world that we see, and we see broken homes, broken relationships, broken workplaces, and we need a better way. And Paul, he's writing in Colossians to the church and to you and me, and he says, hey, there's a better way. There's the Jesus way, and if you're gonna live the Jesus way, then you gotta learn to do the Jesus stuff in your relationships. Like if you're gonna be a disciple of Jesus, then you gotta treat people how Jesus would treat people. You gotta see people the way Jesus would see people. Jesus can't be the Lord of your heart, but not your home. So I need to point something out though for context. What we're talking about today does not make sense and will not work without first living out the first half of Colossians chapter 3 in our lives. Pastor Joey, the past few weeks, spent 2 weeks talking through Colossians 1 through 3, verses 1 through 17. And the Apostle Paul starts by saying, if then you have been raised with Christ, if then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. See, these teachings from Paul are for followers of Jesus. Those have been changed and are being transformed into his image. See, living the Jesus stuff in relationships does not work practically apart from first knowing Jesus personally. See, the Jesus stuff, though, can't stay just personal. We're relational beings. We're created by a relational God, and ultimately the Jesus stuff has to be lived out in the context of relationships. And so before we jump in to verse 18, let's start with some context. See, we always have to remember when we're reading the scriptures that the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. Colossians was written to a church in first century Roman Greco context by the Apostle Paul to the church at Colossae. And Colossae is located in modern day Turkey, and it was written around 60 to 64 AD. And very similarly to how Paul wrote the letter of the Ephesians, he first builds from talking about who Jesus is to who we are in light of who Jesus is, and then to how we now live in light of who Jesus is to us. And so Paul is speaking into this Greco-Roman context to the church in Colossae, and he's addressing some of what they would have referred to as the household structures of their day. And he's writing to these Christians, and he's writing, hey, this is how you should operate in your home. This is how you should live in your home. See, the people there would have been operating under what's known as Aristotle's household codes. And this was important to them because they understood that preserving the household structure was critical to preserving this Roman society as a whole. And they understood this simple truth that oftentimes we forget, that is that as the home goes, society goes. And as society goes, the nation follows. See, the household codes that they would have lived by, though, they taught that women and children were seen as having less value than a man. They were seen as inferior and were suppressed. And then slaves were oppressed, and the man of the home had the ability to do what he wanted, when he wanted, however he wanted. Here's just a little snippet from Aristotle's writings. He wrote, "Silence is a woman's glory, but this is not equally the glory of man." Now listen, if Aristotle had Twitter or X today, like if he posted that, canceled, right? Canceled right away. But then here comes the Apostle Paul. And he's writing to the church specifically addressing this Roman structure. And he adds a new ingredient into the mix. He adds Jesus. Jesus. He says that Jesus changes everything, including the home. He says that these codes should not be so among Christians. There's a better way, the Jesus way. And so do the Jesus stuff rather than the Roman stuff. See, Jesus, while he walked this earth, he broke down social barriers. He touched those who had been declared untouchable. He taught women as their rabbi, and he ate and drank with sinners. He preferred humility to hierarchy. He washed his disciples' feet, and after his resurrection, he appeared to a group of women who would not have even been considered reliable witnesses in their day. And so when Paul introduces Jesus here to the Roman household structures, He's saying that Jesus' ways have now become primary. It's that Jesus at the center of relationships changes everything. This is how you do relationships. Now, a little disclaimer before we jump in here. I get that in this room, there are people of different ages and stages and phases of life. And I get that there's some people in this room that are married and some people in this room that are single. And there's some people in this room that are parents and some people in this room that are not. And you may one day want to be a parent, and you may one day want to be married, you may one day not. But as we're studying this scripture today, my encouragement, my challenge to you is to study and to learn this and grow together with us today. That each and every one of us, we know a wife, we know a husband, we know a parent, we have these people in our lives, and so we're gonna learn and we're gonna grow together. And let's jump in. The first way that the Apostle Paul teaches us of how to live the Jesus stuff is as wives. He says in verse 18, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. See, Paul starts with addressing the wives, and this would have silenced the listeners of their day. When this letter was read out loud, you could have heard a pin drop in the room. The women's ears in the room would have perked up, and they would have said, wait, you're talking to me? Like, men in this society didn't address women. And so for Paul to address the women first would have been completely countercultural and would have communicated value and dignity to them in a way that they had never experienced up to this point. And so he says, hey, wives, yes, you, I'm talking to you. I see you. Submit to your husbands. Now, let's be real. This verse and this word can make some people feel uncomfy, like maybe your hands are sweating now. Because this word submit or submission has been weaponized and wielded in ways that should not be so, and it has caused hurt and pain for women for years. At the same time, it's also been diminished and misunderstood in a way that has caused it to lose the truth and the liberation that it can actually bring. And so today I want us to recapture the freedom that this word submission can actually bring to a marriage. This word isn't a bad word. It's a biblical word. This word isn't about domineering. It's about devotion. This word isn't about hierarchy. It's about humility. See, Jesus didn't dominate. He humbled himself even to death on a cross. Jesus didn't come to be served. No, he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus didn't come to elevate himself. No, he lifted others up and he knelt and washed their feet. Jesus came in full submission to the Father. And through that submission, we were gifted salvation. See, submission is part of the Jesus stuff. And Paul didn't use it flippantly. He wasn't misquoted. In fact, he doubled down on it and he wrote about it as clear as day in both Ephesians 5 and here in Colossians 3. In Ephesians, actually, before Paul even calls the wives to submit to their husbands, he first says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so, yes, the Apostle Paul absolutely goes on to advocate for male headship and clear gender roles within the home. But first, he calls Christians to mutual godly submission to one another. And I would argue that Paul does the same thing in Colossians 3. When you look at verses 12 through 17, he's calling the church to act like Jesus and to live like Jesus first. And so this idea of submission, we see it isn't about power, it's about posture. It comes from this Greek word, hupotasso. Let me hear you say hupotasso. And this is a military word. It means to place under in an orderly fashion or to line up under. And in this same tense, it would have also communicated a voluntary attitude of giving in or cooperating with another. That's what it means. I love how one commentator talks about this. He says, the fact that one soldier is a private and another is a colonel does not mean that one man is necessarily better than the other. Rank has to do with order and authority, not with value or ability. It only means that they have different ranks. God does all things decently and in order. If he did not have a chain of command in society, we would have chaos. The fact that the woman is to submit to her husband does not suggest that the man is better than the woman. It only means that he has the responsibility of headship and leadership in the home. Headship is not dictatorship or lordship. It is loving leadership. It's about posture. There is a call for wives to posture themselves in following their husband's lead as their husband is also submitted to Jesus. See, in the beginning, God created man and woman equal in value and dignity, but distinct in roles. Distinct from one another and at the same time dependent on one another. In the garden, there was structure in marriage before there was ever sin. Like everything goes back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where we see that it was always Adam's job to lead. But Adam, he abdicates that role in passivity and he lets Eve eat of the tree that God commanded them not to eat of. And in Adam's passivity, they sinned. But what happens? God, he comes calling for Adam. He doesn't question Eve first. He comes calling for Adam because Adam was the one that God first called responsible for their disobedience. He was to lead their family and obey God, and he didn't do that. See, it's not that God has elevated men over women. It's that God has called them to give an account for their family. It's a weight and a responsibility that's placed on the man of the home, which, like, ladies, can we be honest? Like, that sounds like a good deal. He gets the weight. He gets the responsibility. It's him who God is calling after. See, the husband's call is to lead, and the wife's call is to let him lead. This is how God designed families to work, but sin has made a mess of that design. In Genesis 3, we see that after they sin, God calls to Eve and he says, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam, God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of. Cursed is the ground because of you, because of Adam. See, the brokenness that we see in marriages today where men try to rule over women and where wives are at odds with their husbands, it's not a result of God having a bad plan. It's a result of our sin messing that up. See, the plan was always submission to one another, wives submitting to husbands and husbands submitting to God, but our sin makes that difficult. Our sin makes that frustrating and makes that messy. But still, God's designs do not bend to our desires. See, in almost 11 years of marriage with Leslie, I've never once looked at her and said, you need to submit. Not once. Like maybe in a joking way, like as a joke one time, but like if people think that Leslie's just over here like submitting to me all the time and this is how marriage works, like that's not the case. That's not what this looks like. In fact, this past week, I've been thinking this over and I was talking with Leslie about it the other day, and there has never been an instance in 11 years of marriage that I've ever looked at her and said, we're doing this whether you like it or not. Never once. But has she submitted to me? Absolutely. It's this mutual, grace-filled, loving way that she's submitted to me, respecting my role as husband, not out of obligation and not out of suppression, but in love. It just happens. See, when Leslie and I were preparing to be married, we read this popular book, Love and Respect, and it's this book that talks all about how simply a husband's core desire is to be respected and a wife's greatest desire is to be loved. And the author says that when a husband feels disrespected, it is especially hard to love his wife. And when a wife feels unloved, it's especially hard to respect her husband. And this happens in relationships and marriages all around us. It's this destructive cycle where we see this lack of respect and this lack of love. But a positive cycle occurs when love motivates respect and where respect motivates love. And it builds this healthy, loving, fulfilling relationship. That's when submission happens without even noticing. So let me be clear, though, on a couple things. Submission does not mean that a wife shouldn't have an opinion or that she should be silent with their spouse. Paul is not saying that all women should submit to all men. No, that's not the case. He's talking about the home. He's talking about marriage, the relationship of husband and wife. And this is why it's so important to be what the Bible calls equally yoked. Because if you're not equally yoked, if you're not both submitting to Christ, then you're always going to be at war, at odds with one another, and it's never going to work right. See, too many people are focused on finding the right mate, but the Bible speaks way more about you being the right mate. And so, women, the call for you is to look for a man that you would love to submit to. And for men, single men in this room, you should focus on being the man that the girl of your dreams would love to submit to. And yes, of course, there's also moral limits to this submission. Notice what Paul says. He says, as is fitting in the Lord. See, a wife is not obligated to follow her husband's leadership if it conflicts with specific biblical commands, if it's sin, if it's opposed to Jesus' ways or his rule or his reign, if it's outside of God's design or desires for us, then submission is void. He says, as is fitting in the Lord. Let's continue. We're going to look at how we live the Jesus stuff as husbands. Paul says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. The word here for love is agape. And if you've been around church for a while, you might have heard someone preach on this word agape before and the different words that we see for love in the Bible. And agape means this selfless, unconditional, sacrificial love that intentionally desires the highest good of another. See, most relationships, they start with romantic love, but godly marriages, they move from merely romantic love to agape love, to sacrificial love. And this is the secret sauce of a healthy marriage, which means that men, like if you loving your wife does not look like you sacrificing something for her, you're not loving her as Jesus calls you to. It always involves sacrifice. In Ephesians, Paul sets the highest standard for husbands. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. See, the command is for wives to submit, but the command for husbands is to die. It's to die. That's it. Like die to your desires, die to yourself, die to your wallet, sacrifice for her, give yourself up for her. See, this was completely countercultural in that day. In the ancient world, under Jewish law, a woman was a thing. She was the possession of her husband. She had no legal right whatsoever. Under the Jewish law, the husband could divorce his wife for any cause. The wife had no rights in the initiation of that divorce. But Jesus shows up in Matthew 19 and he declares, this should not be so. And he initiates this way of sacrificial love that is displayed in that time that was revolutionary. Jesus' way lifted up women and it called men to a higher standard than ever before. In fact, in the Greek culture, under the Greek laws, all of the privileges belong to the husband and then all of the duties belong to the wife. But in Jesus' sacrificial love that he models for us, there's this shared partnership in serving and honoring one another. See, just as Jesus willingly went to the cross and sacrificed himself, men should be willingly making daily sacrifices for their wives. See, agape love always costs something. And this can look like, it can play itself out in small things like helping with the kids, changing diapers, like doing those little things over and over, cleaning up, washing her car, giving her your time, giving her your attention, giving her your listening ear. Men, you need to listen more. And it'll start to shift your perspective. Like I'll never forget one of the best pieces of marital advice I ever got is my friend looked at me and he said, if you see a dirty dish, clean it and put it away. And I was like, what? Revolutionary. And simply what he was talking about is don't wait for your wife to do the thing that you know needs to be done. Like if you see that dirty dish, don't get frustrated. Why is this here? Why didn't someone put it away? No, just clean it up and put it away. Like Leslie, she leaves stuff all around the house all the time. Like her shoes are just everywhere. All in the living room, under the table, under the couch. Like she'll leave them at the door. All these different places. Like next to our bed, on her bedside table, there's just like stacks and stacks of glass cups. Any of you ladies do that too? Just cups, just you leave them there. And it used to make me so frustrated in our early days of being married because I would see these cups and I'd be like, why did she put them away? Why did she put that away? And then this shifted everything for me when I started to see this as rather than seeing this as something that makes me frustrated, what if I started to see it as a way that I can serve my wife? And so the moment that something goes off in my mind of like, oh, why is that there? Rather than being like, oh, why is that there? I'm just like, all right, cool. And I grab it and I put it away and I clean it up. It's a simple way to start to serve your wife, helping with things around the house and serving her. Like single guys, you need to be taking notes, okay? You got to start to learn this early on. And then Paul says, do not be harsh with them. He says there's never a reason to belittle a woman, to be harsh with her. Paul says, don't do it. Like, this is straightforward, to the point. He's saying, men, do not harbor bitterness towards your wife. Do not be passive. Deal with the mess. Talk about the mess. Forgive. Go to counseling, whether you think you need it or you think you don't need it. Unforgiveness will destroy your marriage. And so he says, forgive and work toward healing. Last thing, before I was even married, I was at this marriage conference volunteering on the worship team. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in on one of the sessions and the pastor is preaching, and in the middle of his sermon, he looks at the men and he says, men, eyes up here. He says, men, one day you're going to stand before the Father of heaven, and he's going to look you in your eyes, and he's going to ask you, how did you treat my daughter? How'd you treat my daughter? And in that moment, I'm sitting in that room and I'm like, ooh, shoot. Because I'm single. I'm like, y'all are in for it. And now I'm like, wow. That should change everything. That one day we're going to stand before the God of the universe and we're going to have to give an account for how we loved, how we served, how we honored, how we encouraged, how we cared for the daughter of the King. It should change everything. Paul continues on and he speaks about how we live the Jesus stuff as children. He says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So for any kids in the room or parents in the room, this is important. This isn't about rules. This is about relationship. It's about your relationship with your parents and with God. Notice he says, as it pleases, this pleases the Lord. This is this reminder of the fifth commandment that God gives to the people of Israel. He says, honor, in Exodus 20, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. See, this is the only commandment that God gives with a promise. And Paul's pointing us back to this, and he's saying this is for your good. And in Colossians, though, Paul uses this word, obey. You and I are called to obey our parents as long as we're under their home, receiving their care, receiving their provision, receiving their protection. But when we move out, when we get married, when we are a grown, matured adult, the command to obey no longer applies, but the call to honor remains forever. See, this is important because some of you men in this room that are married, you got to learn to leave your mama so that you can be a better husband to your wife. Got to graduate from that. He continues on how we live the Jesus stuff as parents. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. See, in the Roman world, a father had complete, total authority to treat his children however he wanted. A Roman man could even kill his child without questions. No questions asked. But Paul says this should not be so. He says, fathers, including parents, there's a little footnote there. This is for all parents. Do not be bitter towards your kids. Do not be harsh with them. Do not put a yoke on them that is not from God. Why? Because how you treat your kids will have a direct correlation towards how your kids believe God treats them. Parents, you are the closest picture of Christ that your kids will ever see. And so we need to be asking ourselves in our parenting, what kind of picture am I painting of God? Like, how do my kids see God based on how I treat them? Like, this should keep you up at night. Like, parents, this should rock you to your core. This idea that how I treat my kids is shaping how they see God. And the most important thing in this life is how we see God and how we believe God sees us. It matters. See, research shows that kids have a negativity bias when it comes to their memories, that they more easily remember negative words spoken over them than positive words, which means that your criticism carries longer than your praise. Which means that what we say to our kids really matters. The words we speak to them becomes the inner voice that they are speaking to themselves. And so we need to measure our words. We need to speak words of life into them. Is God kind? Is God patient? Is God slow to anger? Is God abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness? Yes, he is. And so is how I'm speaking to my kids, does it model that? Does that communicate those characteristics of God to them? See, yes, God absolutely disciplines those he loves. Yes, God is a God of order. Yes, God calls us to keep his commands. Absolutely. He is both just and merciful at the same time, and we are to live in that way too. But parents, your leadership to your kids is less about authority, and it's more about your accountability to Jesus. You are modeling for them who Jesus is and how to live the Jesus stuff. And so inspire your kids. Don't crush their spirits. You need to encourage them and cultivate their future. It's often said, for the most part, that children don't create problems, they reveal them. And oftentimes, the frustrations that we have towards our kids are actually frustrations that we have with ourselves or that we have with our spouse that we haven't dealt with, that we haven't worked out. And so the more that you learn to live the Jesus stuff personally, the more you will reveal the Jesus stuff in your parenting. And then he continues on. Paul talks about how we live the Jesus stuff as workers. He says, whatever you do, and work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. This word heartily comes from this Greek word suke, which refers to this idea of the breath of life or your soul. And so Paul is saying that how we work, we are to work from our souls unto God. It's that how you work reflects who you worship. And so Paul is saying, hey, don't just work hard when people are watching. You need to remember that Jesus is watching, and he is. So work like he's watching. You are first and foremost accountable to him. Remember that Jesus changes everything, including how we work. And so Jesus people, they don't just clock in, they show up. They show up, they bring excellence, they bring integrity, they bring joy. See, Christians should be the best employees on the planet. Like, it should be written and plastered on billboards all around the city, hiring Christians because they know how to work. Like, this should be like what we're known for. Like, oh yeah, I want to get some Christians on my team because they know how to work. See, so oftentimes I hear people say, oh, I just got a bad boss. I don't like my job because I don't like the guy that I work for, the girl that I work for, and I don't like the people that I work with. And so I'm trying to, find a new job. And Paul would say, boo-hoo. Boo-hoo. Don't whine. Remember that how you work reflects who you worship. And so work with a full heart. Make the best of every opportunity that you have. Choose to give your best even when you don't feel like it, because you know that you are working for the Lord first and foremost. Paul says, let your work ethic preach the gospel to the people around you. See, you may think that your job is just merely about a paycheck, but living the Jesus stuff requires that you see it as a platform to point people to Jesus in word and in deed. Because the world is watching how Christians work. And so will they see a people chasing status, or will they see a people walking and living in purpose and calling? During a visit to NASA in the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy saw a janitor there working, and he was carrying a broom, and JFK walked over to this janitor, and he introduced himself to him, and he says, hey, what do you do here? And the janitor replied, I'm helping put a man on the moon. See, the janitor knew that he wasn't just cleaning floors. He saw his work as part of a greater mission, something better. See, this is how disciples of Jesus should see all of work. I'm working for my king. I'm building his kingdom. And I just so happen to be programming software. I just so happen to be teaching kids. I just so happen to be closing sales. I am working for my king, and I'm working for his kingdom, and I got a greater purpose, a greater perspective than anything in the midst of it. And then he continues. Paul talks about how we live the Jesus stuff as leaders. He says, masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So really quick on this, if you're in the room and you're a boss, you lead people, you're a leader, we need to be reminded that how you lead reflects who's your Lord. And you and I, when we lead people, we're accountable to God for how we treat those people. Like, God has given you the authority and the job that you're in. And so remember that as a follower of Jesus, how you treat that intern matters. How you treat that employee matters. The way that you speak, the way that you communicate, the words that you use, it matters. It reflects who the Lord of our lives is. There's this story about Dan Cathy. He's the former CEO and president of Chick-fil-A. And it's the story that Pastor Rick Warren used to tell of one day when they were out visiting these different ministry sites, and they, for lunch, stopped at a Taco Bell. And I don't know why the CEO of Chick-fil-A is eating lunch at a Taco Bell. Feels strange to me. Feels like he could eat at a steakhouse or something. But they roll up to this Taco Bell, and before they go to eat, they go to the restroom. And Pastor Rick Warren, he notices in the restroom, while Dan is in there, he had grabbed a bunch of paper towels, and he looks at Dan Cathy, and Dan Cathy's in there scrubbing the countertops and cleaning the sinks of this Taco Bell. And Rick looks at Dan, and he says, "What are you doing? This is our competition. Why are you doing this?" And Dan Cathy responds, he says, "We teach our staff to try to leave every situation they encounter better than they found it." So he's modeling for them. This is how you do it. See, true leaders find a way to add value every day and in every situation. And so leaders, we build up, we add value, we lead like Jesus, we serve people like Jesus because God has trusted us. Number 7. How we live the Jesus stuff as strangers and neighbors. Paul says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Verse 5, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. See, Jesus people, they pray for people. Like, I love the culture of prayer in our church. Like, I see it all the time. People praying over one another, praying over strangers, praying over people that they just met here at church, at Monday men's prayers, and out in the community. It's happening all the time. And see, Paul is telling us that Jesus people pray for gospel proclamation with their neighbors and with their strangers. They pray for boldness. See, walking in wisdom looks like making the most of every moment, not wasting moments at lunch or on that trip or when you're on that airplane sitting next to that stranger that you've never met before, but God has placed you there for an opportunity for you to be able to encourage them and to preach the gospel to them. In that meeting, whatever it looks like, maximizing every moment that we have as a witness to Jesus. See, Jesus calls us to be salt and light, which means that our speech should be seasoned, tasteful, rich, dynamic, and have this substance of truth, which means that we provide answers to the questions that lost people are asking, where the world says, hey, don't be loud with your views. Don't keep your beliefs to yourself. Don't offend people. Don't push your convictions on someone else. Paul says, no. Be wise. Be bold with what you believe and what you know to be true. And so let me ask you, are you maximizing the moments that you have with strangers and with neighbors? Are you engaging in spiritual conversations, boldly sharing the gospel at every moment that we have, speaking love and grace? And so ask yourself, am I doing the Jesus stuff in my everyday life? When I'm out at the coffee shop, when I'm at the car wash, out to eat, at the soccer field, at the pickleball courts, which is very hard when you get frustrated, you're mad. Am I living the Jesus stuff? Am I speaking truth in grace? The people we meet should leave conversations with us, and they should say, I want what they have. I want to know that Jesus that they know. I want that joy that they so clearly have. I want that. Number 8, Paul closes by talking about how we live the Jesus stuff as friends. He says, Tychicus, I told you we'd come back to Tychicus. He will tell you all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose. If you got your Bible, underline purpose. That you may know, underline know, how we are, and that he may encourage, underline encourage your hearts. See, Paul ends with these shout outs to his friends, and we don't have time to talk about each of these shout outs, but I want us to land with Tychicus. See, Tychicus was Paul's loyal, trusted friend. He was this messenger that Paul trusted to give these messages and to bring them out to these churches. He was also a preacher. And Tychicus doesn't get the love that he deserves because Tychicus added great value to the kingdom. See, Paul may have written these letters to the Ephesians and to the Colossians, but Tychicus is who carried these letters to the churches. Without Tychicus, these letters wouldn't have made it to them. See, this is this great reminder for us that we all need a friend like Tychicus. It's that God may give you a word, He may call you to a kingdom assignment. He may call you to a specific ministry task, but you cannot carry that out on your own. You need friends. You need people to help you live into the purpose that Jesus has for you. See, community is the context for the Jesus stuff. You cannot do the Jesus stuff alone, which is why we preach so much here about getting into a group, getting into a discipling relationship through experiencing Equip. Signing up, you need friends in your corner, friends who will pray with you and pray for you, ride with you, correct you, cover you, call you out. See, doing the Jesus stuff means that we add value in every friendship. We stay loyal. We forgive quick. We hurt each other's feelings. We forgive. We speak life, and we propel one another into the purpose and the plans that God has for our lives. See, in verse 8, I believe it summarizes how to be a great friend so well in Tychicus. See, Tychicus was a part of a purpose. Tychicus felt needed. He knew that he had a part to play in this mission. And see, sometimes as friends, God is calling us to help someone else around us feel needed. Give them something to do, empower them, call them into something greater to help carry out this purpose God has for you. Tychicus also made his friends feel known. He says that you have made how we are known among the church. It's that every one of us need to feel known by someone around us. And then he says he spoke words of life, words of encouragement. He lifted people up. He encouraged them. See, the reality is if you do that in your friendships, you'll have some friends for life. Everyone wants lifelong, lasting friendships, but very few people want to do this stuff right here. If you'll serve, if you'll help them live into God's purposes, if you make them feel known, if you speak words of life, you will have friends for life. And so let me ask you, do you have a Tychicus in your life? Someone that's doing that for you? Do you have someone like that in your life? I know I do, and I value that so incredibly deeply. And then how am I being a Tychicus to my friends? Are you doing these things for the friends God has placed in your life? Notice what Paul does with these shout outs. It's his endorsements of the people he's been in relationship with. So I was thinking this week, like in my life, what will be said about me by those closest to me? When you get to the end of your life, what will be the words that the people in your life speak about you? Just like Paul writes these blurbs about all these friends he starts to list off. What will be said about how you built your life, how you lived your life, how you lived the Jesus stuff? Were you compassionate and kind and humble and meek and patient and loving and grateful and devoted to Jesus? Did you live that way? Did you make a difference in the people that God placed around you? Did you live the Jesus stuff in relationships? I want to close with this story. In the early 1990s, Christopher McCandless was this bright, idealistic young man. He had just graduated from college and he had this bright future before him, but he had recognized and seen all the mess of relationships around him. And so Christopher McCandless, he ends up leaving everything that he had, and he goes and he sells his car and all of his possessions, and he's trying to go across America on this journey to find solitude and to run away from people and the mess of relationships. And he saw his parents' marriage crumble before his eyes, and so he's trying to get away from it all. He's like, relationships are too messy. And in the movie Into the Wild, it tells the story of how he journeys across the U.S. and he ends up finding himself meeting these different friends and meeting these different people that all added value to his life, but still he's running from it all. And he runs into the Alaska wilderness and he finds this old bus and he lives in this bus for some time, and he's living on his own and he's writing journal entries and he's out there in solitude. And one of his last and final journal entries that he writes before he passes away from eating this poisonous plant, he writes in his journal, he says, happiness is only real when it's shared. Happiness is only real when it's shared. See, Christopher McCandless was chasing freedom by cutting himself off from people, but he died with this realization that joy is incomplete without connection, without friendship, without community. You need people, and people need you. That's what Paul is building to in Colossians, and he ends with these words. He says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. He says, remember This won't be easy. Jesus said, in this world you will experience trial, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. Living the Jesus way is going to be messy. Doing the Jesus stuff is not going to be easy, but it will be so worth it. And he reminds us of grace, which is fitting because every single relationship needs grace. In every relationship, we need to remember we don't deserve God's grace. We can't earn his grace. It doesn't make sense. It is scandalous. It is wild, but it is incredible that in our brokenness, God would make us whole through his grace that he's gifted to us through his son, Jesus' death on the cross. And so in every relationship, we're called to remember what God gave so that you and I could have relationship with him. Remember what it cost him, his one and only son, so that we could live in relationship with him. And so we season every relationship with grace. We forgive, we seek reconciliation, and we live like Jesus is worthy of our lives. I'm gonna build my life on him. I'm gonna surrender to him. I'm gonna place every relationship before him, and I'm gonna allow him to change my marriage, to change my parenting, to change how I do friendships, to season everything with his grace, because there's no one like him. There's no one like him. Let's pray. Oh, Jesus, we thank you for your grace. And we thank you that in our mess, you came down to live the life that we couldn't live and died the death that we deserve so that we could experience life forever through the forgiveness of our sins, through your cross, and through your resurrection, that we get to walk in new life each and every day. And so God, I just pray that you would make us a people that do this stuff, that live this way, that see you, King Jesus, at the center of every relationship, that see you, King Jesus, at the center of our marriages, at the center of our parenting, and that we place it all before you, knowing, God, that you are in control, that you are sovereign, that you are worthy, that you are enough, and our lives are to be built on you alone. And so, God, as we've journeyed through this book of Colossians, I pray that you would speak to us and continue to challenge us and inspire us, and through the power of your Holy Spirit, make us more like you, King Jesus. And God, I just pray for the marriages in this room right now, God, that you'd bring healing, that you'd bring forgiveness. God, for the ones struggling with feeling connected and feeling known, God, would you breathe life? Would you surround them with the friends that they need and the community that they need? For the ones just struggling in their jobs and their calling and their purpose, God, would you give them a fresh perspective today, that you would help them to see that the way that we work reflects you, who we worship. And God, would you help us to raise kids that know you and love you all of their days because they've seen it modeled, seen your heart modeled in us. Oh, Jesus, we love you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for these truths. And we pray all this in your name, in the power of your Spirit. And everybody said, amen.